Okay, today is the 28th of October. In my language, 28 is wisdom, build or destroy. So wanted to share a little bit about the importance of today, why it's significant, and the importance of the location that I'm sitting in right now. This location is a place known as Freedom Park here in Buffalo, New York. It was formerly known as Broderick Park, but if you can see behind me, this body of water separates the American side from the Canadian side. So behind me is Fort Erie, Ontario, Canada. And the significance of this location is that 194 years ago, my third great grandfather and his family crossed here on October 28th, 1830 to get across over there to the Canadian side, to Fort Erie, Ontario, Canada. So this is 194 years ago. And if you don't know who he was and his family, his name was Josiah Henson. And Josiah Henson is seen oftentimes as a forerunner of the Underground Railroad. And I use the phrase forerunner because when he crossed here on October 28th, 1830, there was not a Harriet Tubman. Her name was Araminta Ross, and she was still a young girl on a plantation along the eastern shore of Maryland. So he was instrumental in helping create that network to freedom that came to be known as the Underground Railroad. Because when he crossed at the age of 41, there were still many people that hadn't made that journey from the South or the Midwest to get across here to the Canadian side. Many people do not know who Josiah Henson is, but they're more familiar with the famous story that was based upon his life. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was an abolitionist and a writer in Massachusetts, published a book that became the best-selling novel of the 19th century that was known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. She published that book in 1852, and that was the first time that slavery was actually put on public display for dialogue and debate. Obviously, all the way up until 1830, people were aware of that system of slavery, but this was the first time that it was put in the public domain in such a way where people can have open conversations and discussions about it. So even though her book was the best-selling novel of the 19th century, she got a lot of negative backlash because you had a lot of people, particularly enslavers, who were striving to discredit her and saying that she made up stories, she was stretching the truth, and she was basing her novel on accounts of enslaved people that was not accurate or true. So copyright laws are not the same today as they were back then. So you had many people who started to write their own narratives and accounts of Uncle Tom's Cabin, changing around the entire story, publishing letters in newspapers discrediting Harriet Beecher Stowe, and even doing stage plays, changing around her story to tell a different story of what a so-called Uncle Tom is. So when people are familiar with that phrase, Uncle Tom, today, that caricature or that propaganda goes all the way back from the propaganda machine that strive to discredit Harriet Beecher Stowe. So now she published that book again in 1852. And when she published that book, she had already been exposed to the narratives and the lives of enslaved people through her research and through people that she actually met that were formerly enslaved that gained their freedom. One of those people was my third great grandfather, Josiah Henson. Because in 1849, Josiah Henson actually published his own account called The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave. now an inhabitant of Canada. So he published this book in 1849, and this book was a staple amongst abolitionist reading circles. He published this book in Canada. And when he published this book, it became popular in terms of people being able to learn about the narrative or the story of enslaved people. So this book was very popular, and this is how Harriet Beecher Stowe got exposed to his story and his life as an enslaved person. Josiah Henson was born on June 15, 1789 in Charles County, Maryland. And his oldest and earliest memory of his father was seeing his father come stumbling in the shanty or the quarters that enslaved people lived in, holding the side of his head with blood running down the side of his face. And that was his oldest and earliest memory of his father. And it wasn't until he got a little older, after his father was actually sold off and him never seeing his father again, that he learned that his father was punished for stepping in to protect his mother. His mother was being sexually assaulted by an overseer at a neighboring plantation, and Josiah Henson's father stepped in to actually protect him and his family and his wife from being assaulted. And when he stepped in, he was accused of breaking a cardinal rule, which was not to even touch a person who is Caucasian or classified as white. So the punishment he received for intervening in protecting his wife from being sexually assaulted is 100 lashes with a whip. And this was done in the center of the plantation so all of the enslaved people could see his punishment and learn from that, so that none of the other enslaved people would ever be insubordinate like Josiah's father. He received 100 lashes. His ear was nailed to a post and cut off. And this happened when Josiah was only 3 years old. So he saw the after effects of this punishment of his father, where his father came stumbling inside of the quarters where they were staying at with blood running down the side of his face. That was his introduction to what manhood was, what fatherhood was. And for the remainder of his life, he never saw or heard from his father again, because his father was sold off to a neighboring plantation, most likely in the Deep South, because of his rebelliousness. So Josiah Henson grew up without a father. When he himself was 18 years old, he was assaulted by an overseer and his colleagues while he was traveling along a road. He didn't even know why he was actually assaulted, but he was hit across his back with a wooden plank, which actually shattered his shoulder blades and broke his right arm. And I tell people all of the time, if an injury occurred on a plantation and something happened to an enslaved person, you weren't put in an ambulance and taken to the hospital. You had to have somebody that lived on that plantation that knew how to set bones back in place, that knew how to gather various different things that you forage from the environment to use for the healing of any kind of illness that you were going through. And that is the way that enslaved people were able to actually heal themselves. We had to heal one another. So when Josiah was assaulted and his shoulder blades were shattered and his right arm broken, he never permanently healed. He was disabled at the age of 18, to the point where he could no longer lift his arms above his neckline. And that's an injury that he lived with for the rest of his life. The same thing similarly happened to Harriet Tubman, where she was hit in the head with a 2-pound weight, which caused her to have seizures for the rest of her life and other different neurological disorders. That was something very common that would happen to enslaved people. because of the sheer lack of recognizing our humanity as people. We talk about slavery, we're talking about people who owned other people and did whatever they wanted with them and to them. So Josiah remained enslaved for 41 years of his life. One of the things that's also important to understand is when you look at slavery and plantations, oftentimes people would be bred and sold to neighboring plantations or sent to other plantations as a means of hiding the property of the enslaver. People who own plantations, they weren't always the best managers of their property. And whenever enslavers were not managing their property well, they risked their property being confiscated. And as enslaved people, you are a part of a person's property. So sometimes what enslavers would do is hide their property or people that they enslaved at other plantations, oftentimes in other states, because they didn't want to get their property confiscated because of their lack of management of the plantation that they actually had. So Josiah's enslaver's name was Isaac Riley in Charles County, Maryland. And because he was managing his property poorly, he sent Josiah and a number of other enslaved people to his brother's plantation in Owensboro, Kentucky. Isaac Riley's brother's name was Amos Riley. So Josiah, at this older age of 41, and his family and other enslaved people were sent all the way down to Owensboro, Kentucky. And once he realized he made it to Owensboro, Kentucky, he was able to recognize that his life was even more in danger because he was slated to be sold down the river to New Orleans. And prior to his escape, he strived to buy his freedom. And his enslaver, Isaac Riley, gave him a certain price. And people will ask all of the time, like, how was he able to make money? I thought enslaved people wasn't able to make money while they were on plantations. Well, if you were given the ability to be a pastor or other different responsibilities on a plantation, sometimes you could actually earn a little bit of money, which usually went to your enslaver because they own you. Josiah was able to travel and to preach at neighboring plantations, the same way that Nat Turner was able to actually do. And oftentimes he was given donations for his service of traveling to different plantations to preach. And because of that, he began to save the little bit of money that he got from traveling to neighboring plantations to preach, and he negotiated a cost from his enslaver to buy his freedom. And whenever he actually got close to that amount to purchase his own freedom, his enslaver kept changing the price. And then eventually Josiah learned that his enslaver never really intended on him being free. He was just using Josiah as a means to monetize what he was actually doing. So every time Josiah got money from going to a plantation to preach, he would give it to his enslaver, and it never went towards his manumission or his freedom papers. So at the age of 41 is when Josiah actually decided to escape, and that is when he and his family arrived in Owensboro, Kentucky on the plantation of Amos Riley, the brother of Isaac Riley. And when he decided to escape, at the time, 2 of his 4 children were so small that he had to carry them in a knapsack on his back. So what he would do prior to his escape in September of 1830 is practice doing work around a plantation with his children on his back so he could actually get accustomed to traveling with them along that journey. So around September 17th, 1830, Josiah and his family left Owensboro, Kentucky on their journey to freedom. When they left Owensboro, Kentucky, they traveled for hundreds of miles until they actually reached Ohio. And once they reached Ohio, they were welcomed into an indigenous village of people known as the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe welcomed Josiah and his family into their village, gave them a teepee to sleep in, fed them. They stayed overnight, and in the morning time, 2 Anishinaabe scouts directed Josiah and his family to a place known as Sandusky, Ohio, which was a port town where boats would actually leave from to take it along Lake Erie up to Buffalo, New York. So once Josiah and his family arrived in Sandusky, Josiah eventually approached some of the people working along the docks, found out who would be willing to take him and his family. In exchange for that transportation, he worked that entire day in terms of loading those ships. And that is the exchange that many enslaved people were able to make or barter for their transportation along waterways. Once Josiah found out that he was able to actually get transportation, he went and he informed his wife and children to lay undercover until he came back to actually retrieve them. So he was literally gone all day. And the captain of a ship known as the schooner Commerce, the captain's name was John Burnham. John Burnham told him once at nighttime, when the ship leaves the dock, he would take the ship back around, circle back around to pick up the family on their journey up through Lake Erie here to Buffalo, New York. And at night, Josiah went back to search for his family, and he learned that his family, he couldn't find his family. He began to panic. And because he was gone all day, his wife and children thought that he may have gotten captured. So they moved from where they initially were to hide in a safer location because they felt that he actually escaped. That he actually got captured, and then he also felt that his family got captured. So he looked around for a while, and then he eventually found them hiding in a different location. Once he retrieved his family, they made it over to the docks in Sandusky, and the schooner Commerce pulled up, and Josiah and his family was able to board the ship to take them from Sandusky all the way up here to Buffalo, New York. And they arrived literally here in this location where I'm sitting at right now on October 28th, 1830. This location where I'm at, there used to be a landing here where a ferry boat would cross back onto the Canadian side and back over here to Buffalo, New York. And this is the actual location that Josiah and his family crossed 194 years ago on this particular day onto the Canadian side that you can see right behind me. His story didn't stop there. Once his family got across to the Canadian side, he settled in an area right over here in Fort Erie that was known as Little Africa. His family lived there for several years. It was on Canadian government land, but it was a settlement for enslaved people who had escaped to the Canadian side. But he wasn't truly satisfied with that form of freedom because it still wasn't full autonomy. It was on Canadian government land. Yes, it was better than here in America, but they didn't own the land. So Josiah called the community leaders together and convinced them to put their money together to find an area that they found suitable to reestablish their entire community. So they commissioned Josiah to find an area, and he traveled further north. From here, where I'm sitting at right now, it'll probably be about several hours by car to get to this location. And that location was known as Dawn at that time. Today, that location is known as Dresden, Ontario, Canada. So Josiah went all the way up to this area known as Dawn at that time, which today is known as Dresden, Ontario, Canada, and was able to purchase over 200 acres of land. And the entire community was resettled in that area, over 185 people. So he was able to actually create what came to be known as the Dawn Settlement, which was another freedom settlement of formerly enslaved people that got their freedom on the Canadian side. He also led a black militia during the rebellion of 1837, a loyalist militia on the Canadian side, and he founded the British American Institute. And the British American Institute was one of the first institutions that was established on the Canadian side by a person of African descent. And it taught teachers how to teach. It also taught trades, or how to actually take advantage of the land that they acquired. And then Josiah would also travel back into the United States on more than one occasion in order to help bring people over to the Canadian side. And he would travel to Europe to seek donations for the operation of his school, the British American Institute. This is the person that people associate with being an Uncle Tom. The same person that would take livestock from an enslaver on a plantation in Charles County, Maryland, and slaughter that livestock out in the middle of the forest and bring the meat back for other enslaved people that was living on a plantation that were being starved. These are the stories that people are not telling you when it comes to that caricature, that propaganda of what Uncle Tom is, because most people don't even want to know anything about it or be associated with it. But the true story is the life of Josiah Henson. So again, he lived on the Canadian side. He built an institution. He established a community called the Dawn Settlement. He led a black militia. He was an abolitionist who would come back into the United States and help liberate people. And then eventually he published this book in 1849, which became a staple amongst abolitionist reading circles. Now, this is an image of Josiah Henson. And when he published this book, that is how Harriet Beecher Stowe got exposed to who he was. So when Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, that was considered the spark that ignited the Civil War in the country of America. When she published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, because of the negative backlash that she received, she published a second book 1 year later in 1853. In 1853, because of the negative backlash, she published a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in that second book, which you can still get to this day, she cites all of her references, where she did her research. She recounts the narratives of people that she used as source material for her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she recounts the life of Josiah Henson in the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and refers to Josiah Henson as the venerable or the honorable Josiah Henson, and specifically says that he was used as a protagonist or the main person that the book Uncle Tom's Cabin was based on. So he is the foundation of that famous novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe cites him in a number of passages in the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what's also interesting is the Civil War in this country breaks out 1 year after Abraham Lincoln is elected president. And a part of Abraham Lincoln's campaign is people were handing out copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that was a part of his campaign material for him to get elected to office in 1860. So when Abraham Lincoln got elected to office in 1860, the Civil War breaks out in 1861. That's when you start to see these southern states secede from the Union, and that is when the Civil War occurs. So now Abraham Lincoln is faced with a conundrum. He has to figure out how to unite the country back together. So this is what's very interesting. As president, him and other Congress members have access to the Library of Congress's materials. And when you look at the records of when books are checked out of the Library of Congress, Abraham Lincoln checks out a copy of The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin from the Library of Congress on June 16th, 1862. And he returns this book 43 days later on July 29th, 1862. Those 43 days in the summer of 1862 align with the exact same time period that Abraham Lincoln is drafting the Emancipation Proclamation. So when he's drafting the Emancipation Proclamation, he's using The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin as source material for him to create that legislation, because he literally checked a copy of it out of the Library of Congress on June 16th, 1862, and returns it on July 29th, 1862. January 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation is actually signed into law, and that is when slavery is so-called abolished, at least on paper.